Before we dive into this amazing Wild West tale, I want to hear from you first. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from Dallas, Denver, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, or maybe even from across the ocean in London or Sydney? I love seeing how far these stories travel, and every comment makes this journey feel even more connected. The prairie held its breath that summer evening, as if the wind itself feared to bear witness. The old well sat at the far edge of a homestead where laughter had long since fled. Its stones, dry and cracked, had once been carved to draw life from the earth. Now it was a gallows. Against the rough lip of its opening, a woman was bound, her wrists lashed with rope, her body slumped but unbroken. Her lips were split from thirst, her skin burnished by 3 days of sun, yet her eyes, dark and steady, still clung to something fiercer than pain. 2 little girls huddled in the dirt nearby, barefoot, their dresses stained by dust. They pressed their foreheads together in a silence too heavy for children of 8. When one sobbed, the other hushed her quickly, fearful of drawing attention. For only a few steps away stood the in-laws, figures of blood and bitterness, watching with the same satisfaction men reserve for a job half done. They had married her brother once into their family, but now, with him gone to earth, they saw no reason to endure the presence of his widow. To them, she was not kin, but shame. They had tied her to the well, not merely to break her body, but to teach her daughters a lesson, that blood could be diluted, but cruelty remained pure. Words hissed through clenched teeth had circled her for months, which, cursed, not our kind. And now the whispers had become a punishment no one dared protest. The town, safe in its cowardice, had turned its back. A widow with native blood was an easy offering for gossip to feed upon. Her voice cracked as she spoke, her plea thin but sharp as flint. "Take my daughters instead of me." The words spilled like a prayer, not of surrender, but of bargaining with the cruelty that loomed. Better that her own body suffer every indignity than watch their small frames crushed beneath the same hatred. The girls stiffened at the sound, clutching tighter at each other, not yet old enough to understand that their mother was not offering them up, but shielding them in the only way she knew. Hours passed in that unbroken stillness. The in-laws, satisfied she would last little longer, withdrew. Their horses' hooves faded into the prairie dusk, leaving dust hanging like ghosts in the air. The daughters crept close to their mother, laying hands upon her knees, whispering their own promises, childish vows to keep watch, to fetch water if they dared, though their buckets had been emptied and thrown aside. It was then the sound of hooves returned. Not many, only one. A lone rider approached along the worn trail, the creak of leather saddle blending with the evening hush. He slowed as he neared the well, his shadow stretching long in the dying light. Elias Boone was his name, though few in town spoke it with warmth. 35, with the quiet that comes from burying too much and speaking too little, he was a rancher of the far hills. He had lost his own once, though whether to sickness or sorrow, no one quite knew. A scar curved across his cheek, like an unfinished word, and behind it lingered eyes that missed nothing. He sat his horse a moment, surveying the scene without haste. The woman bound, the children clinging, the ropes biting red into her wrists. He did not speak, nor ride forward with bravado. He simply watched, the silence between them as heavy as the air before a storm. The daughters looked up at him, hope flickering like a candle near snuffing out. At last he dismounted, his boots settling in the dust. Still no words. He circled the well, studying the knots as though they were part of the land's cruel design. Then, with a movement so deliberate it seemed to take a lifetime, he drew a knife and slit it through the rope. The fibers snapped, falling to the ground like shed skin. The widow sagged, caught by her daughter's arms, her breath ragged but alive. Boone reached into his saddlebag and set down a crust of bread, a skin of water, and a blanket. Not once did he meet her gaze directly, yet his presence filled the night with an unspoken defiance. The woman raised her eyes at last, meeting his shadowed face. No words passed. Gratitude could not fit into such silence, nor explanation. Only the raw knowledge that, for this night at least, cruelty had been defied. Elias Boone turned, mounted once more, and guided his horse back toward the horizon. He did not look behind him. He did not need to. The girls clutched the blanket around their mother, their small bodies pressed close, their eyes fixed on the trail his figure left behind. The prairie fell silent again, yet something had shifted. The well had not swallowed her. The rope had not claimed her. And though the night was still long, The taste of water lingered on her tongue, and the echo of hoofbeats promised that her suffering had been seen. She leaned her head against the stone rim, eyes closing, the world tilting between despair and deliverance. Whether he would return, she could not know. But for the first time in 3 days, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps someone might. The morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of light that makes every flaw in the land stand out sharp. The widow's wrists bore angry bands where the rope had gnawed, but she sat upright now, her daughters pressed close against her sides. The blanket left by Boone clung to their shoulders, thin yet heavier than any kindness they had known in months. They had slept in snatches, waking at each rustle of grass, fearing the return of voices that dripped contempt. Return they did. By mid-morning the in-laws came on horseback, faces shadowed beneath wide brims, eyes narrowed with a satisfaction born of cruelty. Dust rose around them as they dismounted, their boots striking hard against the earth. Still breathing, one muttered, "Shame's stubbornness runs so deep." Their gaze slid over the daughters, then returned to the widow as though she were less woman and more burden, an obstacle to be cleared from their bloodline. The widow forced herself to stand, her body trembling, yet her chin unbowed. Every muscle screamed, but pride steadied her bones. Her daughters clutched at her skirts, sensing the storm that gathered in words not yet spoken. The in-laws drew closer, circling her like vultures that had waited long enough. They spoke of driving her from the homestead, of casting her into the prairie, with no coin and no bread. Each syllable was meant to crush, to remind her she was unwelcome in the family she had once been bound to by love. The townsfolk gathered at a distance, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Whispers threaded through the crowd, some sharp with judgment, others heavy with cowardice. "Best she leave," someone hissed. "It's not our fight," another answered. No hand moved to help, no mouth spoke her defense. The weight of their silence pressed harder than the ropes that had burned her wrists. It was then that the rhythm of hoofbeats returned, steady and unhurried, a sound that split the murmurs like an iron wedge. Elias Boone rode into view, his posture easy, but his presence cutting through the dust like a shadow that could not be ignored. He dismounted without haste, leading his horse by the reins until he stood between the widow and those who sought her ruin. He did not raise his voice. His silence was sharper than any shouted threat. He glanced once at the daughters, wide-eyed, clinging, and then let his gaze settle on the men before him. The scar on his cheek caught the morning light, a mark of his own battles survived. When he finally spoke, his words were plain, steady as stone. "You've had your say. That's enough." The in-laws sneered, voices dripping with challenge. "This is family business, Boone. Not your affair." He met their scorn without flinching. No business justifies tying a woman to die at a well. His tone was quiet, but the weight of it carried farther than any shout. One of the men spat into the dust, muttering of half-breeds and shame. Elias's eyes did not waver. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag, drew out his canteen, and pressed it into the widow's hands where all could see. Then, with the same calm, he lifted the smaller of the daughters onto his horse, steadying her as though she were his own. The second child climbed after, fingers curling into the mane, with tentative wonder. The crowd stilled. Even the gossipers swallowed their words, their tongues caught on the image unfolding before them. The widow's breath caught in her chest, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that this man was not offering pity. He was offering dignity, in a land that had stripped it from her piece by piece. Her gaze met his, a thread of silent understanding passing between them. He saw in her not scandal or burden, but a mother who had endured, a woman who had not broken. She saw in him not a savior, but a soul who carried exile in his own silence. Elias placed his hand lightly on the horse's neck, walking beside it rather than riding, his stride measured and calm. The widow followed, her steps unsteady yet resolute, her shadow stretching long across the prairie dust. The townsfolk parted as they passed, their whispers falling away. For once, no insult clung to the air. The sight of her children astride the horse, the widow walking free, and Boone at her side was enough to still even the cruelest tongue. At the edge of town, the widow turned once to look back at the well. The stones shimmered in the sun, cold and silent, a monument to what had nearly claimed her. Her daughters reached for her hands, their small fingers warm against her own. Elias tipped his hat, the motion slight, almost reverent. She answered with a nod, the smallest gesture, yet it carried the weight of survival. The horizon stretched before them, vast and open. The future was uncertain, the journey ahead heavy with shadows, but for the first time in many nights, hope stirred in her chest like an ember refusing to die. Boone walked on, steady as the land itself, and she followed, her daughters safe, her spirit unbroken. Some rescues came not with bullets or fire, but with bread, water, and the quiet resolve of a man unwilling to look away. And sometimes that was enough.